Hello.
Welcome to this session on investigating indigenous issues. My name is Jan Gunnar Furuli. I work for the daily newspaper Ahtone in Oslo, and I'm also from the Sami community in the Arctic part of Norway. In this session, as the organizers have stated in the introduction, First Nations, indigenous people, they are 5% of the world's population. Inside their homelands, 80% of the world resources are, and there's a lot of pressure on these resources. Native people have been under genocide. A cultural genocide is still going on, and as some of the speakers will tell, there are still people getting murdered and kidnapped because of their origin. Some very prolific cases the last couple of years has been the Standing Rock protest about the Dakota Access Pipeline. There's been other prolific stories like the stories you have told from Australia and Canada, US, with podcasts receiving tens of millions of listeners. In our area in Norway, a lot of European countries, like Germany, is putting up windmills, which is stealing a lot of the grazing land for reindeer herders, both in Norway and Sweden, so you guys can have cheap electricity. We also have mining companies who are doing a lot of activities and are destroying land which belongs to the First Nations, many places on the globe. In this panel we have Allan Clarke from ABC Australia. We have Connie from CBC in Canada. And we have Tristan Ahtone from the High Country News in Texas. So you can start, Tristan. You have the floor.
Okay. Thank you. I'll pull out the PowerPoint here. It's in German. I'm going to guess. Is this the presenter view? Okay. Perfect. So yeah, my name is Tristan Ahtone. I'm a reporter with High Country News, and I serve as the president of the Native American Journalists Association. And the Native American Journalists Association is a group of about 600 indigenous journalists in the United States. We work to empower tribal media outlets, Native journalists, and work to help mainstream news outlets essentially do a better job when reporting in indigenous communities. We do a lot of things like defend free press, increase representation. We also do things like put out a lot of different guides. This is always, we're try to be a resource for people who are trying to do a better job or learn about reporting in indigenous communities. For example, we have our very fun bingo board. This is the bingo board that you don't want to get bingo on. If your story is hitting on some of these themes, you might want to think twice about actually doing that story. We have essential elements of a tribal-free press, where we talk to tribal governments about what laws they need to be enacted in order to protect their press outlets. We also work with GIJN here on our guide for investigative journalists. You can go to the website right now and check out all of the guides that are available for folks that are interested in reporting in indigenous communities, not only in the US, but globally. We do some other fun stuff like our story manifesto that we put out about 2 years ago. I'm not sure if there's any Dogma 95 fans in the room, but it's sort of based on the film manifesto that was put out about what reporters should not be doing. For instance, stories should not be treated like resources to be exploited. Fixers and translators should share bylines and be paid equal wages. Some of it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it's always sort of guidance for reporters who are wanting to do better work in Indigenous communities or communities worldwide that have been historically underserved, even though that's kind of an ugly word. But for instance, also, stories must never be characterized as something that no one is talking about, because chances are that community is already talking about it. You just discovered it, so like, don't do that. We also represent about 200 different news outlets in the U.S., tribal news outlets, ranging from magazines to radio to television. You can kind of see the spread here across the U.S. Tribal governments tend to support these tribal media outlets. Philanthropy generally does not fund local or hyper-local Indigenous news outlets. So it's created sort of an environment where tribal governments recognize the need for having news, but also because they are sort of agencies under those tribal governments, those reporters are often treated as employees. So it becomes a real problem for actual tribal press freedom, is that when you have stories of accountability of your tribal government, you actually have to answer to the tribal government because you're being paid by them. Essentially what that is that most tribes have free press laws, but building a firewall between actual tribal news outlets and tribal governments, right now there are only 5 tribes that actually do that out of 573 tribal nations in the U.S. So this is a really, really huge problem that we're trying to work on at NAJA. Part of that has been through doing surveys of tribal leaders, media makers, media consumers. So for instance, looking at who owns or has controlling interest in tribal media, we're being able to learn that 58% are owned by tribal governments, again, creating a really big free press problem. We've also been able to take a look at, do tribal citizens have adequate access to information about tribal affairs? And only 58% of our survey results have shown that people have access to information at all. So again, as we work to influence and advocate for tribal governments to enact tribal free press laws, we're surveying, trying to use that data to make sure that we can advocate in the best way possible. As well, does your tribal media require prior approval from government? We're seeing almost 32% say so at tribal media news outlets. Basically when we look at like the World Press Freedom Index, I would argue that this map is actually incorrect. When we look at the U.S. Is sort of an orange color in terms of press freedom, when you have another 573 nations that aren't following any sort of free press laws or helping with free press, I think that changes that map quite a bit. One of the ways that we're also working to increase press freedom in the U.S. In tribal governments is, while we're doing the advocacy stuff, we're also working to train our reporters in working with whistleblowers, working with confidential informants, working with sensitive data. So, for instance, last year, my news outlet, High Country News, we worked in parallel with a few other Indigenous outlets to cover sexual harassment at the National Congress of American Indians. It's sort of the representative body for tribal nations in the U.S. And working with whistleblowers, working securely, we were able to gather information and data that led us to discover that sexual harassment and forms of sexual or racial harassment had been going on inside of the organization for almost a decade. And we're able to find the documentation and talk to people who could help us put that story together, leading to the head of the organization, the executive director, stepping down after 18 years on the job. So being able to work in our own communities in a way that is going to keep sources safe and keep information safe has been one of the big things that we're continuing to work on at NAJA. As well, when it comes to a lot of the investigative reporting we're doing at High Country News, we're looking at stories like racism directed at Native American athletes. That's going through and pulling down data, news articles, et cetera, over period of time to start getting a picture of what racism actually looks like for Native athletes that go to different towns, different places to compete in basketball, football, whatever it is, and started getting a better picture of what actual harassment looks like. And while in the U.S., since the Trump administration has taken power, we have seen an increase in racism in the U.S., or at least documented racism. But when we actually look at the data, we can see that Indigenous people have been having to deal with a steady flow of racism at these different events over the last 10 years in time. So we're beginning to get a much better picture of what racism actually looks like in Indigenous communities. As well, last year we put out an investigation on the aftermath of the Standing Rock protests. And what we were able to do was look and see the number of people who were getting money on GoFundMe to raise money for Standing Rock or to get out to Standing Rock. And essentially over the course of our investigation, we identified about 250 campaigns that had raised more than $3,000 each, totaling about $8.1 million that individuals raised for Standing Rock or to get there, and that none of that money actually ever showed up to the tribe. All using publicly available data on GoFundMe. We just built a scraper, pulled it down, pulled names, information, amount raised, contact information, and we're able to find a number of really, really questionable accounts. And this kind of information is really, really important, especially for our communities, because a lot of the names that we were seeing in that data, we're seeing those names pop up at a lot of the different organizing events that are going on around the U.S. We have the Line 3 pipeline that's being built or proposed in Minnesota. We're seeing a lot of the folks that were in this data organizing there. So it's a really, really great resource. We made all of the data public so that reporters could go in there, communities could go in there and see who was actually raising money, for what purpose, and what they did with it. Here's an example of the data. And generally, though, lastly, we're also at High Country News. We're essentially one of the first news outlets that adopted an Indigenous Affairs desk. There have been another 7 that have come online in the last year. Next year, we're looking at another 30 potentially coming online. So we're seeing that this is one of the fastest sort of growing areas in journalism to be covering Indigenous affairs and Indigenous communities around the country, hopefully around the globe as well. And we're sort of happy to be doing this work and seeing that there is such an interest. Obviously, the biggest issue that we're seeing is that a lot of training is necessary, and a lot of work is necessary to make sure that reporters are doing it in the right way. And I believe our other panelists are going to talk a little bit about that. So that's a brief overview. So thank you.
Great. Hello, my name is Connie Walker. I'm a reporter at CBC News in Toronto. So that's the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. I've got my PowerPoint on this. Like Tristan, I've seen, I got it, thanks, yeah. I've seen just really a huge dramatic shift in not just the volume, the number of stories from Indigenous communities in Canada, but the kinds of stories in the last 5 to 7 years. And so I think that if you're interested in telling stories from Indigenous communities, there's never been a better time to take on these stories. I think that there's finally a recognition that these are important stories. They always have been, but finally there's a recognition that they're important stories. And I think that we've also been able to prove that there's an audience for them, that these stories are connecting with millions of people. This is a picture of Cleo. She was the subject of our podcast, Missing and Murdered, Finding Cleo, which was a true crime podcast that investigated her unsolved case, but also tried to tell a bigger story about the realities of life for Indigenous people in Canada today and how that's connected to a part of our history that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. But I want to unpack just a bit of that transformation. I've been a journalist for 20 years at CBC, and there wasn't always interest in stories from our communities. I've always been interested in telling them. I've always wanted to be a part of that, but but it really was kind of a struggle for a long time to kind of make the case that these are important stories and that we should be looking at them. And I want to give an example of one of those instances. When I was, in 2006, when I was an associate producer at a national current affairs show, a television show in Canada, in Toronto, which is kind of the capital media center in Canada. A girl who I knew from back home, I'm from rural Saskatchewan, I grew up on my reserve, a girl named Amber Redman, who I knew from back home, went missing. And I heard about it through one of those email chains. This was even before Facebook and before social media, but her family had kind of sent out an email saying that she had disappeared and they were trying to get some attention about her disappearance. And it was the same summer that in Toronto, another young woman went missing, and her name was Alicia Ross, and she was blonde and a white woman from downtown Toronto, and her disappearance was covered on the national newscasts in Canada. It made the national newspapers. And I remember thinking that there were so many similarities between Alicia and Amber. They were these two young women who had their lives ahead of them, whose families were desperate to find out information about them. But Amber's story barely got any local coverage in Saskatchewan, and Alicia's story was getting national news. So I remember going into my producer's office at the time and pitching a story. One of our mandates on that show was to analyze the media. I wanted to pitch a story about took a critical look at why these two disappearances were getting such different treatments. And I remember my executive producer at the time putting up her hand and stopping me through my pitch and saying, "This isn't another poor Indian story, is it?" And that just stopped me in my tracks. That, you know, I felt like there was no avenue for me to go on. And I don't think that I'm alone in having those kinds of experiences in mainstream newsrooms when trying to pitch stories that were important. Luckily, that's changed. I think, 10 years later, I was part of a unit that was dedicated to helping to tell stories from our communities, but also that was shining a spotlight on the issue of violence against Indigenous women, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But it was a slow progression, and I think that for those of you who are working in newsrooms or who are interested in telling these stories and who are working in newsrooms and are facing that struggle and that battle, I just want to talk a little bit about how things and why things shifted so much in Canada to see if there are any takeaways for you. One of the big game changers for us was in 2012 at the CBC. I should also mention that all of my experience is at CBC. I've worked at CBC for 20 years. But there are also, there's the Aboriginal People Televisions Network, which is an Indigenous run and operated network in Canada that has also been pushing these stories forward, and that's been their mandate from the beginning. But one of the things in 2012 is I got to work on a documentary series called Eighth Fire, which was a 4-part documentary series that was supposed to be an examination of the relationship between Indigenous people and the rest of Canada. And so we had 4 hours, which sounds like a lot, but if you're thinking about being inclusive of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people across the country in English and in French, it was a bit of a challenging project. But I remember it was the first time in my career that these kinds of resources had been dedicated to stories from our communities. And I remember, and I still get goosebumps when I think about, seeing Indigenous people on TV and hearing Native accents in primetime television, and that I remember feeling so proud that I got to be a part of that. Following Eighth Fire, a couple of months later, I was on mat leave then, but Idle No More kind of just, woke up the Canadian media that had largely ignored Indigenous issues unless there was some terrible crisis or conflict that was happening in our communities. And Idle No More was kind of spraying from social media and these connections that Indigenous people were making with each other on social media, and culminated in these flash mob round dances that were held in Canadian cities across the country, and basically, forced the Canadian media to finally pay attention to Indigenous people who were fighting for recognition of Indigenous rights, and really better representation as well of our stories. And that, I think, was a really formative moment. And I think that shift to digital has really helped push connect our communities and really help push and amplify our stories. The thing that came from that for CBC is we started a website, a page online that was dedicated to Indigenous coverage. It was originally called CBC Aboriginal, now it's called CBC Indigenous, but it was basically like an online home for all of the Indigenous content that was happening across our network. And it was, again, like we had to sell that this was going to reach people, you know, that this is, after I don't know more, that there was an audience out there who was interested in these stories. And I remember at the time we started, and I was the only reporter, and I had a senior producer, and we were a team of 2, and we got to work with some other Indigenous journalists one day a month for the first little bit. But I think that the expectations were pretty low about these are some of the journalists that we got to work with one day a month. But there were times that after we launched where we were beating whole other regions in terms of our page hits. And so we quickly proved that there are metrics that support that these are important stories for Canadians. And that then started shifting and making space for Indigenous stories on the other platforms, television and radio, the more traditional platforms. Before that, I think that we had mostly, white editorial leaders in newsrooms who kind of got to decide the agenda and decide what was important to Canadians that day for the nightly newscast. And then that started to change. One of the big things that also happened in Canada was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which traveled across the country to hear stories from residential school survivors. And I'm going to assume that people know what residential schools were, but I remember a year before the final Truth and Reconciliation Commission event, exactly 1 year before, I was covering a story from a different Indigenous community, and I was supposed to have a story on the National that night. And I called into the desk, and they said, "Oh, we're going to hold your story because we already have another Indigenous story tonight, and you couldn't have 2, right?" Like, that was the idea. And I was mostly grateful because I really needed an extra day to work on my story. So I was like, okay, whatever. I kind of rolled my eyes. But exactly 1 year later, when the Truth and Reconciliation final event happened in Ottawa, it led the national newscast for 5 nights in a row. And on the day that the final report was released, the whole first 15 minutes of the show was TRC coverage. So in 1 year, like the digital push really just pushed its way across all of the other platforms. And that, I think, is a really important, that was an important moment, I think, for in my career. That kind of led to us focusing on the issue of violence against Indigenous women at the network. And for us, I think this really was, we were able to provide, this was kind of a gateway into a better understanding about Indigenous stories in life in Canada. This really underreported issue for a long time, this community that was underrepresented. Finally, people were paying attention to this issue of violence against Indigenous women. And we launched a database of unsolved cases where we tried to focus not only on the numbers and the statistics, but to show that every single woman and girl has a family and a community that loves them and misses them. And that really led to a bunch of things, but the podcast that I ended up working on. So now that there's finally an acknowledgement that these are important issues, the question becomes, how do you responsibly cover stories from Indigenous communities? And this is a quote from Dr. Marie Wilson, who was one of the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, talking about the importance of context when covering stories about our communities. She said, "Don't skip the context. That's the biggest trap I know for all working journalists when time is of the essence. If you can't explain it in this story, explain it in the follow-up. When did this story actually begin?" And I think that when you're thinking about a community, an Indigenous community that has a long history in Canada, the United States, Norway, Australia, New Zealand, but has largely been misrepresented or underrepresented in mainstream media, the context becomes one of the most important things that you need to think about in that coverage, because you're not just connecting the dots about whatever it is your story is that as a journalist, you have a responsibility to connect that back to this part of history that is untold or misunderstood, or that people don't have enough awareness about. And it was hearing Dr. Marie Wilson, tell that to a room full of journalists that really helped it click with me, because I didn't always get that right. You know, I didn't always understand how important the context was. I was guilty of sometimes focusing too much on the mystery aspect of some of the unsolved crimes that we were reporting on. And, you know, it's hard to include the context, but I think that it's incredibly worth it. I know that I'm running out of time, but so this is Cleo, and in the podcast, what we found is that, you know, as a news reporter, I'm used to filing stories that are like 2 minutes long, or maybe sometimes if it's kind of a doc, you get to have 7 or 10 minutes. But with the podcast that we did on Cleo and her family, we ended up doing it over 10 episodes, and in totality, it was over 7 hours, like almost 7.5 hours. And so it's a lot easier when you tell a story in that length of time to meaningfully weave in the context and to tell that story. But I wanted to just run through a couple of examples of lessons that we learned in the podcast. This is Christine, and I just want to play a clip from this. She is Cleo's sister, and she's been searching for Cleo, she and her siblings, for decades, because they were all apprehended by child welfare authorities when they were children and separated and kind of scattered across North America. This is a phone call that Christine has with the government of Saskatchewan, who, you know, this is where the family, they were taken into care, and so that she believes they have information about Cleo and they know where she is, the information that she's been searching for. And I wanted to include this because I think that when you have this underrepresentation and misunderstanding of who we are, that we have to kind of confront those stereotypes in our reporting, that we have to somehow create some space so that people can have empathy for an Indigenous woman who, you know, when this issue of violence against Indigenous women started making the news, you know, it was often focusing on these really negative stereotypes of what it meant to be an Indigenous woman. You know, focusing on their circumstances rather than the truth about their lived experiences. And Christine was just so amazing at being able to connect with people on a human level. Podcasting obviously allows you the space to do that, but I just want to play this clip of her. Oh no, I can't find it. I think it's there. Hold on. Oh yeah, there it is. This is her talking to a woman from social services asking about her sister. You have to present, sorry. Oh no, it didn't work. If I can't get it, then that's, yeah, I don't know why it's not. Sorry guys, I'll move on. But it was in the clip that Christine, you know, she knows this woman has the information that she needs. And in that phone call, you know, she's being kind of cagey with her and saying like, I'll have to look into that and I'll get back to you and let you know what I can share. But she kind of reveals something that she knows where Cleo was adopted into. And Christine asks like, do you have a sister? Can you imagine what it's like for me to not know where my sister is after all of these years? And just like, I feel like that moment really just helps you understand her lived experience. Maybe in the discussion we can talk a little bit more about some of the other things around understanding the role of trauma in Indigenous communities and why that's so important, that there's a whole history of trauma that Indigenous people live and experience, and that is an important thing to consider when doing any kind of reporting on Indigenous communities. And also being aware that when a community has had people come in and just drop in and do some reporting about whatever conflict or terrible thing has happened and then leave, that there's a lack of trust that exists between communities and the media, and that it's important that you're respectful when you engage with communities and are mindful of that history, and instead of trying to take stories and tell them for them, that we try to do a better job at amplifying people's voices, and that's something that I think that is a lesson that I'm still learning. Anyway, I hope that we can continue that conversation after, but thank you very much.
just find my PowerPoint. So I'm Allan Clarke, and a lot of my work actually intersects with the stuff Connie does. So I'll try not to kind of, repeat. So let me just... So I'm Allan Clarke. I'm from Australia. I'm an Aboriginal man. In fact, my tribes are Gomeroi and Murruwarri. That's in northwestern New South Wales. I was lucky enough to grow up around my traditional country with a very big Aboriginal community. Just a little bit about sort of my background and why I got into media. I come from a very small town in the outback of Australia. And growing up, there was a sustained attack, I guess, if you like, from mainstream media on my community. So it's a town of 3,000 people, very large Aboriginal population. There is issues within the community. There is high rates of substance abuse. There's high rates of suicide. There's high rates of crime. And so for a time, newspapers were coming in, using that trauma to sell newspapers and essentially demonise my people. And so I grew up in this environment, and I remember there was a front page newspaper article on one of our biggest newspapers calling my community the most dangerous place in the world. And what they'd done is they'd pulled statistics and said per capita there is more crime here than, say, somewhere like Bogota, which was the most dangerous place in the world at the time in the 90s. And I just remember feeling really outraged by that because the community I grew up in had nothing to do with this one that was being put out in the media. And so I felt like it was really important for me to go into media and try to reshape that narrative, try to reshape the way we talk about Aboriginal communities, First Nations communities, Indigenous communities, and actually give context. And as Connie said, context is just absolutely key when you're talking about these things. These issues don't happen in a vacuum. There is intergenerational trauma. There is decades of unimaginable abuse, racism within these communities. So of course there are going to be issues. So that's why I got into media, and I'll just walk you through a little bit about some of the work I do. I'll just quickly mention, just in terms of Australia, these are just some very quick stats. So we make up 3% of the population. We are 30% of the prison population. We're 14 times more likely to be homeless than a non-Indigenous person, twice as likely to commit suicide, more likely to die in police custody. And just for some context there was a Royal Commission, which is a public inquiry in the late 80s, early 90s, because so many Aboriginal people were dying in police custody. We had to have an inquiry about it. That inquiry or commission gave 339 recommendations. Since that time, there's been more deaths than recommendations, which is just an indictment. And our life expectancy is 10 years lower than everyone else in Australia. And there's a 50-50 chance that we'll finish school. So this is kind of, shocking when you think of Australia being this incredibly wealthy country. We have top-rate healthcare, amazing education system, and this is happening to just 3% of the population. So that's just a bit of context about why I work in Indigenous affairs space and why it's important. So for years I worked in newsrooms, I worked in Indigenous affairs, and I always came back to the issue of the justice system and the Aboriginal community, so the intersection between that. If you want to look at the problems that underpin, say, in particular Australia, those historical issues, they all intersect at that judicial level. So since colonisation, Aboriginal people have been targeted by police, we've been mistreated by authorities, and that continues today. And One area I just didn't find much information on was unsolved Aboriginal murders. So there is a lot of talk about domestic violence victims. There is a lot of talk around just that issue in general, although the problem is, especially those women that are murdered by their partners, it's never really seen as homicidal murder. And I thought, okay, let's look into this a bit more. And then what I found was that actually led me to other families saying, hey, we have missing people in our family, we have murdered people in our family, and no one's done anything about it. So I made it sort of, I guess, my remit, if you like, personal remit, to actually then go and explore this issue further. And this guy here is Mark Haynes. He's a 17-year-old Gomeroi boy. He was found on train tracks, dead, outside of a town called Tamworth in 1988. And 6 years ago, I met his family, who were begging me to basically do Mark's story. They said that the police had not done a proper investigation. They said there was institutionalised racism at play. They said suspects weren't interviewed, witnesses weren't interviewed. And it was a very intense experience, because this is a family who were grieving for 20 odd years. No one was listening to them. So when I came along, they were like, oh my God, bombarding me. So Mark's uncle gave me all of the documents, inquest papers, and I thought, okay, I'll look into this. Like, I could see that the most basic of investigations weren't done. And so I started that 6 years ago. I then started to do news stories wherever I was. So I was at several different outlets. I'm primarily a broadcast journalist. So I went from taking it at my job at SBS, which is a network, to even BuzzFeed, where I started the Indigenous Affairs round a few years back. And then ABC, our national broadcaster, said, would you think about coming on board and making a podcast? And so that's what this is, Unravel, and I'll just play you the trailer. If I can.
If there is internet.
Do I need internet? No.
Sure.
Oh. None of our media is working.
I'm glad I'm not the only one who had to.
No.
Phew.
God.
They said there's been an accident. Mark's been found on railway tracks.
Just outside Tamworth, a 17-year-old Aboriginal boy is dead.
I just said, oh, Mark, it just broke me. I cried.
Not Mark. Why Mark? Not Mark. He was gone.
Is it suicide, misadventure, or something more sinister?
Well, what we didn't see was any blood.
And under his head there was a towel, it was a white towel.
And we picked up a comb and a pink cigarette lighter.
And that's so I said, no, I'm sorry, you could not drive a car. No way.
The jigsaw puzzles didn't fit.
A million questions, why, how, who, what.
A country police investigation, overshadowed by the politics of race.
You know how it is. Young Aboriginal men, they just walk away, lie down on railway tracks and wait to get hit by a freight train. That's actually their answer.
That was their story, you know what I mean? But it wasn't our story.
A family on a 30-year fight for justice.
So I just done what any family would do for their loved ones. Question, what was that?
Leave it there. So Unravel, Blood on the Tracks was the culmination of pretty much 6 years investigating Mark's case. It's the biggest project I've ever done. It was incredibly difficult to pull it together. We did so there was a 7-part, I'll show you the content. So we did a 7-episode podcast series. We did a 2-part television series. I wrote a 6,000 word long read for online. We did a 365-degree interactive video of the crime scene for YouTube. And so if you go to YouTube, you can literally see me at the crime scene, walking you through it with things popping up. You can actually move around, quite amazing. We did numerous news items throughout the investigation, just to make sure that people knew that we were on this and that, you know, we were ahead of the curve in case any other journalists were coming on board. That helped, you know, prove that we had skin in the game. And then we did Instagram stories closer to the drop-off. So we were tailoring basically this trailer, changing that for Instagram. And then we were doing Facebook and Twitter posts as well. So everything was tailored. It was a very big curated project. However, all of this helped to push the case forward. And basically, we got all of the things we wanted to do. So we had the police released a reward for Mark's death, a $500,000 reward. We got the case reopened. We also got some of Mark's body remains, tissues returned from, they were sitting in an archive in Sydney. The family didn't even know that their coroner's court had them. We found out they had them. We got them removed and taken back to Mark's country to be buried. And we also are getting, the homicide squad are looking at reopening the case at the moment. So that's the sort of biggest story I did, and just in terms of my methodology and the way I think, because this is a very true crime type of story. So for years when I was doing Mark's story, it was very little interest from people, and I was covering it in a very traditional Indigenous affairs way, which is, you know, which a lot of people don't seek out, sadly. So mainstream audiences don't actively seek Indigenous or First Nations stories. So after about 5 years, I was a bit jack of it and said, okay, I want people to actually engage with this story. An injustice, a miscarriage of justice has been done. We need to do something about it. So we wrapped it in a true crime package, but underscoring the whole thing was very much a story about injustice. And it was a really great way to bring new audiences to the actual story and actually get them to lobby for things to change. So Connie had spoken about the idea of, you know, getting empathy from audiences that might not, you know, kind of relate to Aboriginal people. And so that was our number one challenge, to try and get the rest of Australia to actually feel empathy for the family so that they could go along with the ride and then lobby and get angry and make change. And that worked really well. That was basically us being able to subvert the narrative in a way. And so I call it, so there's this 1-2 punch. So basically it's make it palatable and then punch them in the face. I mean, that's how I really think. That's my motto. And so it was great. You look at the trailer, you look at all the other content, you think this is a great mystery, this is a very true crime thing, the most, you know, true crime's so hot right now. And then you pull them in, and basically as you go along, people are invested in it, then you start to weave through that historical context, why this is wrong, and people then start to feel empathy for the family. So it's basically Trojan horsing the story, just making it look like one thing when really it's another. And the thing with that is, it's terrible that I have to do that, but I think sometimes you just have to try and get as many people into these stories as you can. And so it's about disrupting the deficit discourse. So most of the reporting around Indigenous affairs is a deficit discourse. It's all of the negative things without context. So it's really important to try and smash that. It's not saying shy away from the issues within our communities, but it is about making sure that you have a responsibility to talk about why these issues exist. And often that's rooted in history. And then aim for like world impact. So if you're going to start reporting in Indigenous communities, you really need to foster some kind of relationship with them and work with them, collaborate with them to actually have some real world impact. Don't helicopter in and out. And our stories aren't, you know, are not, you know, for a certain type of cachet, or we call them, you know, kind of award hunters. So we have a lot of non-Indigenous journalists come into Aboriginal communities, take a story, go off, get awards for it, and they have nothing to do with the community after that. So it's a very, yeah. So if you're going to do it, you're going to need trust, access, time, partnership, and always put the family and the community first, and then go to the authorities afterwards. And I think that's a really important way to think about it. I'm really conscious of time, so I'll stop. But I've got a lot more points. I'll put them on the tip sheet, so if anyone wants to look at it, they can go look at the tip sheets. But maybe we could have a discussion.
Yeah, a short question. What would be your best advice to young aspiring reporters, or any reporter who wants to report on Indigenous issues? What should I do to be successful?
I would say it is about building trust with communities. It's about actually having boots on the ground, really, and not using a community to sort of further your own career, or, you know, I think it's really important that trust and a relationship comes into play. So building that trust early on will put you in best practice for the rest of your career.
I think there are some really great resources out there right now for non-Indigenous people who are interested in reporting on Indigenous communities. NAJA just partnered with the Global Investigative Journalist Network to come up with a guide for reporting, and Tristan can speak to that, I'm sure. But there's also a reporting in Indigenous communities guide that was created by one of my colleagues named Duncan McHugh, which is really just kind of a simple primer, you know, and he did it back when, you know, people were just becoming interested. So you can find that at riic.ca, but maybe Tristan could talk a bit more about the guide that NAJA's, and NAJA has resources as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of resources. The GIJN resources are great. I think more, even more deeply when we're talking with non-Indigenous reporters that are wanting to do this kind of coverage, as y'all have said, it's really talking about community and really being a part of community. So, for instance, with you know, reporters that are going to be embedded in communities and reporting there, we talk about reporting for a community instead of reporting about a community. And at High Country News, for instance, we think of our audience as Indigenous readers. That's who we're going after. That's who we're wanting to write for. But when we're thinking about it that way, it really helps us cut through a lot of the sort of surface stories that places do, the sort of deficit frame, you know, because we are members of the community. That idea of like, no one's talking about this story. Like, we know what people are talking about. You know, we want to provide content and stories that our Indigenous readers are really going to enjoy. And we found that non-Indigenous readers really, really like it a lot. So thinking about that is really one of the sort of guiding principles. And we always talk about, you know, if you're a non-Indigenous reporter, you need to be going to community art events, like on your off time. We even encourage people to go to funerals. You have to be a part of the community in order to show that you're not there as an award hunter, which I love that phrase. I'm using that from now on, because there are a lot of Native Story Award hunters out there. So
I think what amazes me, a lot of young reporters just don't do research or educate themselves about communities. Yet I know young reporters who will be on a science round or a court round and will study that till the cows come home and have all of this knowledge about how the court system works or whatever subject they're exploring. Yet when it comes to Indigenous affairs, there is this lack of kind of drive of people to actually go out and find out about the community they're about to go into, and part of that is them also not looking at independent Indigenous media who've covered all of these stories before, and also the importance of acknowledging that. So, I mean, the information's there. I often get people coming up to me asking me about completely random questions about the Indigenous community, and I'm like, well, go and Google it first. I mean, it's important to go and talk to Aboriginal journalists and producers, but at least make an effort before you come and you think I'm this fountain of knowledge on everything Indigenous. So,
Connie, you were speaking about the impact and the interest for stories about Indigenous societies. Do you feel that how important is your platform? You are both in like the national news organizations, and you're making stories. Does the platform and also this podcast trend, did it help you a lot?
Yeah, I think that podcasting, shifting to podcasting, really is a game changer for me. I was primarily a television reporter for most of my career, and now, don't tell my bosses or anything, I'm like, I would be okay not to do a TV story again, because it's I think that the impact that we've been able to have with podcasting is unlike anything I've ever seen. I think that traditional TV or online, or fighting for seconds and minutes, really, right? On our web articles, we're like, okay, that person read that story for 30 seconds. We can actually tell how long everyone reads for and how many times they scroll down. And it's actually kind of depressing sometimes when you work hard at a story and you're like, oh, that didn't have a very long engaged minute time. And on television, I feel like it's almost radio silence. Even if you get more than 5 minutes or 10 minutes, you put it out there, and then you're like, maybe there's some echo that comes back. But with podcasting, it's immediate, and you're engaged with an audience that is already social, already digital, already interacting with you and sharing, and there's a conversation that happens that is so exciting, I think, to be part of. And again, just to say the same thing over again, the amount of depth you can get into on a specific story is incredible. The podcast that we did was about the mystery of this girl and her disappearance and her family searching for her. And it's very much centered on this true crime in the same way that Allan's podcast is, this finding Cleo, what happened to Cleo. But we were able to weave in really a lot of Canadian history that people didn't know. And it's had a lot of impact, and it's being taught in schools. And for me, that's one of the most rewarding things.
I think we're so lucky now with all of the different mediums we can play with, and like Connie, I worked most of my life for television, and then I made a conscious decision a few years ago to move into a digital space, and I went to BuzzFeed, and it was an incredible learning curve in terms of how online works, but where I was able to really tailor content for different audiences as well. And then going to do the podcast was something completely different. But I guess the podcast is the holy grail to tell these stories, because when else do you get 7 episodes and you decide the time for each episode, so you can actually give it what it's worth, whatever subject there is. And it was just an incredible experience, and really that podcast community are quite incredible, and if they are engaged with your content, they will come along for the ride. I mean, we had guys starting Reddit threads, this kind of, because everyone wants to be a detective, right? So there was, and then they were talking about conclusions, and then it spawned this ecosystem of talk around the case, which then, basically the police could not ignore the noise, and they had to do something about it. So they started to speak with the family again, and they reopened the case. It was a really incredible, but also a totally different medium, because it scared me, coming from TV, to do something so intimate and be actually in people's ears. But I think that's why so many people fell in love with Mark's family, was because they weren't on television in this short little package, this kind of set narrative. Here's an angry black man, here's a family with a chip on their shoulder, we're just going to switch off. They couldn't do that in the podcast, because we were kind of slowly bringing them in, and these were just voices, and it is an incredible medium. Yeah.
One last question from me before we open for questions from the floor. Back in my home village, the national broadcaster has a Sami division with indigenous reporters, and they are often accused of being biased. So the majority will say that you're biased. You can't report on Sami issues. Do you often hear this?
I did for a long time, and I think that it's true that we're, as Indigenous journalists, we're often accused of being advocates before we are over journalists, and I think that that's unfair for so many reasons. I think that our personal lived experiences and our connections to communities and the issues that we're reporting on only helps the journalism, helps you connect the dots in a meaningful way, helps you understand something, and I see it only as a benefit in order to get access to communities, in order to tell stories in a really meaningful way. Not that non-Indigenous people can't do that, but I think that we are just better positioned in a lot of ways. And I always say that I'm an advocate for the truth, and the truth about the realities that Indigenous people live, and why there is this overrepresentation of Indigenous kids in care, or there is this water crisis in Indigenous communities, like connecting those dots for people and telling them the truth that they haven't learned in schools or in mainstream media up until now.
For a very long time, I was told that all I could do was Aboriginal stories, and then as I got sort of more established in my career, I was told I'm wasting my time on Aboriginal stories, that I should be doing foreign correspondence work or things like that. But and so there's lots of mixed messaging, and I think we have to actively, as journalists and producers, actively try to change workplace culture in newsrooms, and actually try and encourage the knowledge that, say, Aboriginal journalists have, that it is an asset, and it could help better the reporting for everyone. But I think and doing that is finding allies within newsrooms and trying to change that culture of Aboriginal affairs is somehow less worthy than, say, a war correspondent. It's just about changing attitudes, and it's interesting to start looking at how we do that within our workplaces, which is great that y'all are here. That so hopefully, if you're getting into this space, you also become an ally to Aboriginal people working in the space, and bat for them when you see something that is unethical or wrong within your organisation.
I think in my career it's definitely swung from, that's advocacy, to maybe that's all you should be doing, to something in between. It's, when you're dealing with white stream media, it's very like schizophrenic a lot of times. Like it just jumps back and forth a lot, and maybe that's the wrong word to be using, but it's just unreliable. It's unreliable to be working with a lot of non-Indigenous reporters and editors, because they never quite know what they want. But in response to your question about, are we advocates, it wasn't until, in the last 5 or 6 years that I just realized, oh, actually you're just being racist. I got it. I get it, you're sending your white reporters out to report on white issues without a problem. What you're really telling me is that you want access to my community, but you don't want me to be a part of that. And so, I think that's something important to remember, is that a lot of news outlets want access to our communities. They're asking us a lot of times to come on to their organizations so that they have more access to our communities, but also don't really want us involved in that process. So, when we're kind of thinking about our media strategies, I think we're all dealing with similar media environments, using a lot of different tactics to make sure that our stories are told. But I think it is important to remember that a lot of outlets do want the stories that we can tell, but a lot of outlets don't really know how to handle them a lot of times. So you're having to navigate some really, really sort of tenuous areas.
Okay, do you have Do we have any questions? There's a mic over there. Yep. Please present yourself and pose the question.
Okay, so hi, my name is Fabiano. I'm a reporter from Brazil. I'm based in Manaus in the Amazon. So half of my stories involve indigenous communities in the Amazon, and now with this president, where there has been one of the strategies for him to convince people to open indigenous territories for mining is saying that it's a successful story in Canada. It's a successful story in Canada, that it's working well in Canada. And my question for you is that I know there has been many traumatic experience with mining inside indigenous tribes, including high suicide rates. And I wonder if you have reported about this mining inside indigenous territories, and what is your conclusion overall?
I guess I would wonder where he's getting that information from, that it's successful. I think that there is, again, a long, painful history of communities interacting with corporations around resource extraction or development. Manitoba Hydro, for example, that again are just starting to get attention in Canada. I mean, I'd be curious to know what information he's using. There are some journalists in the audience as well who work at the Aboriginal People's Television Network, and I know that you guys have done a lot of stories specifically around Manitoba Hydro and mining. I don't know if you guys want to speak to that at all. But I mean, I think that just in general, that these are ongoing issues that have not been resolved, and that there are ongoing conversations around pipelines being built that pass through Indigenous territory, and there's such a diversity in terms of the experiences of Indigenous people and the diversity of nations. You know, there are 632 First Nations in Canada, and there's not one Indigenous voice or one Indigenous experience. There's so much diversity, and people are just starting to pay attention to that. So there are some communities that maybe have agreed to, you know, partner with some kind of resource extraction project, but there is also a lot of opposition to that. So there is no one experience. Do you want to add anything, Francine or Trina?
I would say, like, having done stories on natural resource projects, a lot of times when you talk to government, they'll say, oh, well, we signed an impact benefits agreement, an IBA, and that it's a good thing, and there's jobs and employment and money for the First Nation that might be living near the resource project. But in reality, the jobs are like the low-paying jobs are not the good jobs at that project. There's a lot of times Indigenous women who live near that project, and there's mining camps. There's stories now of abuse and things that can happen to vulnerable people when you have a mining camp in a remote area in particular. And there's a lot of environmental concerns. Even in, like, I did a story on a massive hydro dam, and it's like clean energy and all that stuff, and it's touted as a good thing. But for the Indigenous people that are there, if you talk to them, if the president of Brazil talked to them, they would say that it's actually you know, endangering their ecosystems and their traditional foods, and culture, and all of that stuff is tied to access to those foods. So I think, yeah, it's a matter of perspective and maybe cherry picking a couple of success stories, or even the Canadian government, the way they present sometimes how those natural resource projects or the companies say, oh, well, we're working with Indigenous people. And when you talk to actually Indigenous people on the ground, a lot of times you're going to get a different perspective. So.
And we can share some specific examples of that. Yeah.
There's a new question over there.
Hi, my name is Andres. I'm from Colombia, and I've also covered indigenous issues for a couple of years, especially as they intersect with environmental issues. And I thought it was really interesting what Allan was saying about this disrupting the deficit discourse, because I feel that a lot of the times in countries like mine, where we do not have a very significant population, indigenous population in terms of it being more or less between 5 to 10%. So the challenge is, how do you get the rest, the other 85% of the country engaged in these issues, as you well said. And a lot of the people have this idea that there's only a negative coverage when it comes to indigenous affairs, lacking anything, lacking something, whether it's historically or now. And there's, especially with environment issues, for example, there's a whole lot of solutions, of not necessarily just positive stories, but very interesting things that have been happening within or around indigenous communities in which they play a pivotal role, and in reporting about has shown me that there could be very interesting things. So I wanted to ask you if, in terms of not just the problems that indigenous communities have been facing, you find there's specific areas in solutions to major problems where you think we are underreporting, or we are not looking enough at things that we should be doing.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think flipping that deficit discourse, one part of that is, in your reporting, is actually looking at grassroots solutions or community-led solutions. So what's often left out of all of this is that, we talk about all of the issues facing Aboriginal communities. We talk about domestic violence, we talk about drugs and alcohol, we talk about prisons. What we don't talk about is that there are actual people on the ground, Aboriginal people in those communities, actively trying to fix these problems with little to no support from the government or NGOs or big funding bodies. And so they're the people I feel that need to be propped up. And in a way, you are talking about hard issues. Domestic violence is a good example. In the Northern Territory in Australia, there are several small groups of women who are victims of domestic violence themselves from these communities, who've come together and basically do it off their own back, their own money, to go out and try to fix this problem. And no one reports on those women or gives them agency to try and get some kind of funding later on. What you hear about is the federal government has invested millions of dollars in trying to fight these issues, but that money never reaches the ground, really. And then this competitive tendering process where Aboriginal communities are a commodity for big non-government or not-for-profits who are all competing to have money to try and run programs that actually are disengaged from the community. So I would say you take those issues, then you find those communities who are doing amazing things, and then you start to give them a voice and a platform, and you see it through, and you give some longevity to that. Because yeah, in the beginning, people might not be interested, but after a while, people start to take notice. And that idea of advocacy, I mean, it's or lobbying. So often I sort of have crossed the line to lobby for groups like that. And not so much as going to a politician and saying, like trying to lobby them, but it's actually just being their support in the city and going and putting their names in front of people who can make things happen. And so that's how it starts, and then that becomes a news story, and then it snowballs. But yeah, I think if you look at those community-led solutions and the people who are doing that and focus your reporting on them, it's like, okay, because otherwise the rest of the population look at this and go, well, what are they doing to help themselves, Where's all this money going? It's like, well, actually look at these people. They are trying to fix the problems in their own community.
If I can just add to that, I think this is also the idea of reporting for a community versus reporting about. Like, you can come to me and tell me, like, how dirty my apartment is all you want. Like, it doesn't really, like, I get it. I know. I live there. I think that, like, when it comes down to what people are actually reporting on, this deficit lens here, there are ways to subvert that. But the other thing is actually going to a community to report and asking, like, what is the story? I mean, a lot of times I go to places and actually my favorite people to talk to are like high school students, because they'll just rip you Like, they will tell you everything that's been wrong with media that has been there before, and they'll be more than happy to tell you what you should be doing. And I love that. Like, I love being able to go someplace and say, is there a better story? And usually you find it. So again, it's like I can, you know, you know, a story about violence in an indigenous community, you know, we're aware of that. You know, there's usually not a whole lot that reporters are adding to that story. They're just getting to it anew and maybe doing something slightly different, but they're not adding anything new. When you get past the sort of stuff that people already know about and are already working to do something about, then you get to the real sort of stories that maybe you should be doing.
Okay, as we are in Germany, we have to stop on time, and our time has ended. So thank you very much.
Thank you.